The room had the stillness of a place abandoned by time. Dust floated in faint, colorless strands, moving only when the door eased open and released a quiet breath of colder air. The investigator paused in the threshold. This forgotten farmhouse on the outskirts of Linton had once held the final minutes of a life, and now it waited, unchanged, uncorrected. A dim lamp in the corner flickered with the same fragile rhythm it carried the night the case was sealed away, and the air smelled of old wood, dry soil, and a silence that pressed its weight onto everything it touched. For 39 years, the scene had been preserved in photographs and fading memories, but today it felt disturbingly present. The investigator stepped in, boots whispering across the warped boards. What little light crept through the curtained windows struck the dust that coated the abandoned table where a small ceramic mug still stood. Its handle was cracked, its surface chipped. It belonged to Marielene Vyne, age 26, a local librarian with no enemies, no secrets anyone could agree on, and no story that explained why she never made it to work on the cold morning of November 4, 1986. The initial report had described her as calm, introspective, soft in manner. She kept journals, taught reading classes to children, volunteered at the community pantry. Nothing in her life hinted at violence, and nothing in her final hours suggested a struggle. She was found lying near the center of the living space, head turned slightly as though she had been listening for something. What struck the investigator even now was how composed she appeared in the old Polaroids. No sign of fear, no defensive wounds, no overturned furniture. Everything had been orderly, controlled, quiet. The cause was blunt trauma, a single strike, no forced entry, no footprints other than hers. The weapon never recovered. The investigation at the time was thin, restrained by limited resources and colder weather that destroyed what little trace evidence existed outside. The case stalled quickly. Interviews yielded nothing useful. Her family had fallen into a grief that made memory difficult. Her coworkers described her as lovely, steady, distant at times. Not unusual, nothing suspicious. The investigator walked deeper into the house, letting his eyes adjust to the muted shadows. He felt the careful detachments of a trained mind, catalog, analyze, observe. But something human persisted, an old weight that years of experience never lifted. Every cold case carried that same intangible presence, a quiet question about what had been missed or who had gone unheard. He knelt near the place where Marielene had been found. A faint outline remained on the floor, barely visible unless the light hit it at the correct angle, a reminder shaped by absence. The investigator brushed a finger along the wood, feeling the subtle change in texture. He whispered something, more breath than word. No witnesses, no noise reported, no signs of flight. A life ended in silence, leaving behind a void that resisted explanation. The farmhouse door creaked behind him as the wind pressed against it. He turned back toward the small kitchen area. A photograph from the archived file resurfaced in his mind, a picture of the same space taken by the responding deputy decades ago. Objects were arranged almost identically now. It was as though time had agreed to hold the space together until someone returned to listen properly. He moved to the shelf above the counter where several books were stacked, their colors faded. On the top sat a thin notebook, marked with a faint set of initials. MV. It had been logged as evidence once, briefly examined, then deemed personal and irrelevant. The investigator's hand hovered over it now, hesitating. Something about the slight bend in the spine suggested it had been opened recently, far more recently than 1986. He touched it lightly, feeling the cold roughness of the cover. A sense of scrutiny tightened his breath. This wasn't supposed to be here, not untouched like this, not after so many years. The scene felt less still now, as if the dust itself was aware of his presence. He lifted the notebook, careful not to disturb any potential prints left by whoever had last handled it. A single page trembled loose and floated gently to the floor. He watched it land near his boot. A torn photograph. Half of an image, edges jagged. A woman's hand visible in the frame, resting on what looked like a wooden desk. The rest was missing. It hadn't been in the original inventory. The investigator bent down slowly, extending his hand. But just before he touched it, he stopped, caught by the faintest sound, a soft tick, no louder than a fingernail tapping glass, somewhere deeper inside the house. He straightened, listening. Silence returned like a closing door. But the moment had shifted, subtly, undeniably. Someone had been here long after the case went cold. And something small, something long overlooked, was beginning to unfreeze. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The notebook lay open on the table inside the station's evidence review room, under a cone of pale light that revealed every crease, every smudge, every careful stroke of handwriting. The room itself was quiet, insulated from the hum of daily operations. Only the soft rustle of paper answered the investigators' movements. The case had been dormant for decades, closed not by conclusion but by exhaustion. But now, due to this anomaly inside the farmhouse, it had reopened. The chain of custody records showed no sign that the notebook or the torn photograph had ever been processed. Either the item had been misfiled after initial handling, or someone had removed it long before the archives were digitized. The investigator studied the first page. Marielene's writing was small, neat, deliberate. The entries were dated sporadically. Most contained reflections, work schedule, small observations, moments of solitude described with patient detail. But halfway through the notebook, the tone shifted. Things became sharper, phrases shorter, as though the entries were written quickly under some internal pressure. A line caught his eye. He said he needed time. I said nothing. I think he knew I didn't believe him. No name, just he. Another entry read. Someone knocked last night. 3 times, very late, I didn't answer. Then, the same sound again, not sure if real. The investigator pressed his thumb gently against the margin without touching the ink. These were never analyzed during the original inquiry. At that time, the officers had assumed the writings reflected ordinary anxieties. A young woman living alone in a rural area might record small disturbances without indicating real threat. But combined with the torn photograph, the context changed. He reached for the evidence gloves and placed the half photograph beside the notebook. The hand in the picture, Marielene's, presumably, rested near a set of papers. What mattered was the angle. The shot had been taken from above her, slightly behind. Not a self-taken photo. Someone else had stood over her when it was captured. The missing half became more important than the visible one. He leaned back, breathing in the faint sterile scent of paper and worn file folders. The overhead light flickered, momentarily distorting the shadows around the desk. He replayed the sound he heard in the farmhouse. That subtle tick, almost insignificant. A pipe expanding from temperature change. A loose fixture settling. Or the quiet residue of someone who had been there recently, leaving behind a disturbance too slight to register but too intentional to dismiss. He turned another page in the notebook. The later entries sharpened further. He was outside again, same shape near the shed, didn't move this time. I have to decide what to do, but I feel watched when I write this. Then the last entry. A voice at the window, not words, just a presence. I hope I am wrong. No date, just a sentence suspended at the edge of unease. The investigator closed the notebook carefully. The logical implication was immediate. Someone had been near the farmhouse repeatedly in the days or weeks before her death. Someone she recognized enough to describe without nomming. Someone who could enter quietly, strike once, and leave no trace. The case reopened officially at 0914. A digital entry marked the timestamp. Fresh evidence logged. A cold file stirred awake. The torn photograph was sent to digital reconstruction. Analysts began searching for any corresponding full images in local archives, yearbooks, newspapers, personal collections. The investigator returned to the farmhouse that afternoon, accompanied by a forensics tech. They searched the structure more thoroughly: attic, crawl spaces, storage corners. They found nothing new inside the house. But behind the shed, beneath a loose plank, the tech uncovered a thin cloth pouch containing two items: a metal button and a fragment of paper with faint ink marks. The button was old, possibly from a coat or uniform. The paper, too, fragmented to read but clearly torn from something larger. The investigator held the button under the weak gray daylight. Its underside had a hairline scratch shaped like an inverted curve, too deliberate to be accidental. A memory surfaced, a detail from the initial report. The responding deputy had mentioned speaking with 3 individuals who came forward that week: a coworker, a neighbor, and a man from the grain elevator who claimed he'd seen Marielene a few days before she died. The man had been wearing a dark coat. The coat had metal buttons. The investigator felt the cold air settle deeper against his skin. This case wasn't waking up by coincidence. Something old was returning, piece by piece. 3 investigator examines, past reports to identify overlooked details. The archive room smelled of cardboard, ink, and the long, faint scent of documents that had spent years pressed together. Rows of shelves lined the room, each holding histories sealed in thin manila envelopes. The investigator pulled the box labeled Vyne, Marielene 1986, onto the narrow table and opened it slowly. Inside were the original scene photos, handwritten statements, lab notes, and the lead sheet that detailed each interview conducted during the first 72 hours. He started with the photos. In the early prints, the interior of the farmhouse appeared stark, almost too clean. The coffee table was dusted but not polished. The counter held a single plate and fork, rinsed but not dried. These were normal details but felt strangely purposeful now, as if Marielene had been preparing for something, either expecting someone or avoiding someone. Her life seemed paused mid-motion. He turned to the lab notes: soil samples from the porch, fibers from her coat, minor traces of pine dust in the entryway. The presence of pine was explained in the margin, likely from chopped firewood stored outside. But the investigator paused. The farmhouse yard had no pine trees, none within immediate distance. He checked the topography records. The nearest pine cluster lay nearly 3 miles away, along a narrow stretch behind an abandoned service road. Someone who visited her carried it in. He underlined the record lightly with his finger. Next, he unfolded the lead sheet. 3 names stood out again. Eli Bander, coworker. Tessa Krall, neighbor. Jonas Hart, grain elevator worker. Each had provided short statements. None had been flagged as suspicious. The first interview transcript belonged to Eli. He described Marielene as quiet, dependable, last seen returning borrowed books 2 days before her death. His alibi had been solid. He worked a double shift that night. Tessa, the neighbor, claimed she hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. Her handwriting on the statement was tight, angled. She had added a small note at the end. She kept her curtains closed more than usual that week. That detail hadn't been followed up. Then came Jonas's statement. Brief, almost too brief. Saw her on Monday. She seemed distracted, didn't talk long, left early. He had no recorded alibi after 7 p.m., no additional notes, no secondary interview, nothing connecting him further. But there was something else, an omitted connection. Jonas lived near the pine cluster. The investigator sifted deeper. A small plastic sleeve held a faded map of the area, sketched during the early search effort. The farmhouse, the roads, the shed, the field boundaries. A path drawn faintly behind the property line led toward the pine cluster. It wasn't an official trail, more like a solitary footpath. The investigator exhaled slowly. Something had been missed. Something that waited 39 years for someone willing to see it. He slid the sleeve aside and turned to the final document, the responding deputy's initial scene description. It was thorough but carried a single line at the top. Front door locked, back door unlocked, no signs of forced entry. Unlocked. Someone she allowed in. Or someone who knew how to move silently in familiar spaces. The investigator closed the file carefully. The weight of the documents pressed lightly against his palms, a physical reminder that stories survive even when answers don't. The overlooked details were no longer fragments. They were forming a pattern. A quiet one. A patient one. And it was beginning to speak. The interrogation room had been repainted twice since 1986, but the lighting remained the same, flat, colorless, unforgiving. The investigator sat alone at the table with 3 thin files laid out in front of him, each marked with a name that had once mattered briefly before fading into irrelevance. Now they waited again, silent participants in a case that had forced itself back into the present. Outside the narrow window, the late afternoon sky over central North Dakota hung low and gray, smoothing the landscape into a single muted tone. It was the kind of weather that made truth feel heavier. Eli Bander, coworker. Eli arrived first, hands folded and shoulders slightly hunched, a posture suggesting neither guilt nor confidence, just discomfort at being pulled into a cold memory. He was older now, lines around his eyes forming quiet maps of time spent avoiding questions no one had asked in decades. The investigator maintained the same slow, clinical pace he used for all cold case interviews. Did you visit her house that week? Eli blinked. No, never did. His voice wavered not from deceit but from the strain of remembering. She kept to herself. We all did, I guess. The investigator noted the minor tremor in his hand but didn't press it. Eli's motive, if one existed, was thin. Their connection had been strictly professional. The only anomaly was a workplace disagreement recorded 2 weeks before her death, a scheduling dispute. Too minor to shape a motive, too distant to align with the tone of her final journal entries. Did she seem worried about anyone? The investigator asked. Eli breathed out slowly. She seemed quieter, but I thought she was just tired. Tired was the word people used when they didn't know what they were seeing. When Eli left, the room felt unchanged. His presence left no echo. Tessa Krall, neighbor. Tessa entered next, wearing a calm expression that had grown accustomed to years of living with unanswered questions. Her hands clasped lightly in her lap. She glanced around the interrogation room as though expecting to see shadows familiar only to memory. The investigator opened her file. You mentioned she kept her curtains closed. Tessa nodded. Yes, not always, but that week it felt deliberate. Did you speak to her? Once. She seemed distracted, looked over her shoulder a few times. I asked if she was all right. Tessa paused, searching the air for the exact tone of that moment. She said, "I'm fine," but it didn't sound true. Her statement aligned with the journal entries, strengthening the impression of a threat close enough to unsettle her, but unclear enough to leave unspoken. Anyone unusual around the property? Tessa hesitated. A shape near the shed. One night I thought it was her, but when I looked again it was gone. The investigator leaned back, composing a mental overlay of her memory atop the physical map. The shed, the pine dust, the hidden pouch with the metal button, these threads intersected in a quiet, troubling way. Tessa had no clear motive, no conflicting timeline, no personal closeness beyond neighborly observation. But her memory confirmed that someone had been near the shed long enough for her to sense it. She left the room with a composed step, the door closing softly behind her. Jonas Hart, grain elevator worker. Jonas arrived last. He had a stillness about him that felt less like calm and more like practiced neutrality. His dark coat, not the same one from 1986 but similar in style, hung loosely from his shoulders. He removed it carefully, folding it over the chair with a precision that caught the investigator's attention. He sat upright, eyes steady, posture controlled. The investigator opened the file slowly, letting the pages shift with purpose. "You saw her the Monday before she died." Jonas nodded. "Yes, she brought some pamphlets, asked about schedule changes at the elevator." "Did she seem worried?" He paused just long enough to notice. "Not that I recall." His voice was even, measured, each word placed carefully in the air. "Where were you the night she died?" the investigator asked. "Home," Jonas replied. "No one with me." He offered the statement plainly, but without any added explanation or regret, as if he had said the same sentence many times before. The investigator observed his hands, calm, steady, free of tension. Then his eyes focused, guarded. Jonas's composure didn't feel defensive. It felt calculated, like a person who had learned long ago how to manage attention. The conversation continued in short, fragmented pieces. "You knew her well?" "No, just in passing." "Ever visit her home?" "No." "Ever walk near her shed?" A small shift barely there. His left eyelid tightened, then smoothed. "No reason to." When Jonas stood to leave, he adjusted his coat again, smoothing the sleeve with the same measured motion. His footsteps were soft, evenly spaced. When the door clicked shut behind him, the investigator remained still for several minutes. 3 suspects, each holding different motives or none at all. Eli, no motive, weak tension. Tessa, no motive, no alibi needed, only observations. Jonas, no alibi, ambiguous connection, quiet precision. None of them fit cleanly. But the case didn't require a clean shape. It required a crack, one small enough to miss, large enough to matter. The investigator leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the silence settle. Someone had been near the shed. Someone had moved quietly in the dark. Someone had left pine dust and a metal button behind. Someone had been close enough to photograph her hand. Suspicion, like dust in the farmhouse air, began to gather, not loudly, but in a slow, deliberate shape. 5 clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. Night settled over the station in pale layers of blue and gray, the kind of subdued darkness that concealed nothing but softened everything. The investigator returned to the evidence review room, needing the quiet more than the space itself. The torn photograph lay on the table beside the digital reconstruction report, while the metal button sat under a glass dome, reflecting the dim overhead glow. He opened the reconstruction results. The analysts had restored what they could: faint shadows, partial outlines, and the faint edge of another hand, larger, positioned near Marielene's wrist. The angle suggested proximity, perhaps too close for comfort. But what mattered most was the background, a wooden surface with a narrow groove. The investigator recognized it instantly. The desk in the grain elevator office. Jonas hadn't mentioned she visited him there. The investigator's breath steadied. He studied the faint marks along the right border, signs the photo had been torn deliberately, not accidentally. Someone had removed the part that would reveal the second person fully. He turned to the metal button next. Under magnification, the curved scratch appeared intentional, a small marking, perhaps made by a tool. A personal identifier, a habit, a nervous tic. He traced its shape on paper, overlaying it with photographs from the initial interviews. The scratch matched the faint indentation on the sleeve of Jonas's coat from 1986, the same coat noted by the responding deputy. Not a smoking gun, but the alignment was unmistakable. Still, the investigator remained cautious. Evidence should speak slowly, not loudly. He revisited the journal entries, tracing the progression of her unease, the subtle shift from routine observations to strained reflections, the mention of a presence near the shed, the unspoken fear. A pattern formed, one not of sudden conflict but of creeping emotional pressure. Someone she knew, someone she once trusted enough to speak with, someone whose behavior had changed. He returned to the archived interview notes. Jonas's transcript was incomplete. Only a single page was preserved. A second page was referenced in the index but missing from the file. The absence was too precise, too convenient. He searched the misfiled folder drawer in the back of the archive room, where old documents sometimes slipped through record updates. 10 minutes of methodical sifting revealed a loose sheet, yellowed, folded at the corners. Page 2. The handwriting belonged to the responding deputy. Subject appeared unsettled when asked about last interaction with V. Looked away several times. Mentioned brief disagreement over borrowed items. No follow-up. Borrowed items. No mention ever made again. Borrowed what? Pamphlets, papers, something personal. The investigator checked the notebook again. The later entries mentioned someone knocking, someone outside, someone whose presence she recognized without nomming. One line earlier overlooked now stood out clearly. He asked for it back. I didn't want to give it. It didn't feel right. Not time, not space. It a physical object. Something she had taken or kept. Something the unidentified visitor wanted returned. Something worth confronting her about at the window. The investigator aligned the entries, the photograph, the missing page, and the button. The inconsistencies connected not through dramatic evidence, but through emotional residue, discomfort, pressure, fear. The kind of conflict that grows quietly until it changes the air of a room. He returned to the farmhouse at dawn. The light crept through the clouds in thin streaks, illuminating the shed behind the house. The hinges groaned softly as he pulled the door open. Inside, the dust lay thick, undisturbed except for a faint path, 2 parallel lines near the back wall. Something had been dragged or placed there years ago. He knelt, brushing away the dust. Beneath it lay a wooden panel with a slight indent along the edge. He lifted it carefully. Inside the shallow compartment were old papers, brittle with time. One page contained a faint signature. J. Hart. The investigator's pulse remained steady, controlled. He examined the second page. It showed a partial inventory list from the grain elevator, numbers scratched out, discrepancies marked. Another page showed a brief note in Marielene's handwriting. "Keeping these until I know what they mean. Quiet motive, quiet conflict." He closed the compartment slowly. The air inside the shed felt colder than outside. The emerging truth was not dramatic. It was patient, logical, incremental, built from small details that had waited decades to be seen together. Someone had visited her repeatedly. Someone whose work records contained discrepancies. Someone who asked for something back. Someone who had reason to keep those papers hidden. Someone who understood the landscape well enough to leave no footprints in the snow that night. The clues aligned with a soft, deliberate inevitability. The silence that had held the case together for nearly 4 decades was beginning to fracture. And behind that fracture, a shape was forming. A shape with intention. A shape with motive. A shape that once knocked softly on her window in the dark. Morning light seeped into the evidence room in a thin, muted line that stretched across the metal tabletop and touched the edges of the reconstructed photograph. The investigator sat still, posture controlled, expression unreadable. Before him lay everything the case had been waiting for. The journal entries, the missing interview page, the metal button, the torn photo, the hidden papers from the shed. The pieces had arranged themselves, not through revelation, but through quiet logic, each detail settling into place like dust returning to its original shape. But the conclusion forming in front of him was not the one he expected. He had believed the trail pointed to Jonah's. The metal button, the missing page, the torn photograph, each thread drifted toward him like instinct. Jonah's had always seemed slightly too composed, slightly too careful. His silence felt structured, not natural. Yet something was wrong. Something small. Something that had lingered at the edges of the original reports, unnoticed because it did not announce itself. It remained faint, hidden beneath assumptions. The investigator opened the notebook again. He read the final entry slowly, letting his eyes move through the pauses. "Someone knocked last night 3 times. The same sound again. I feel watched." He asked for it back. Then, one line the investigator had dismissed earlier. "Light under the door, not mine." Light under her door. But the farmhouse had only one outside door, the front, and she always kept the main lamp on when she wrote. If she saw an unfamiliar light under her door, then the light had to originate from inside, not outside. Someone had been inside her home before she realized it. Someone who knew where to step without making noise. Someone she wouldn't expect to find there. The investigator turned to the initial scene photos. The lamp in the corner had been left on, but the angle of the light on the floor, barely noticeable, suggested repositioning. Someone had moved the lamp the night she died, casting light toward the hallway rather than toward the sitting area where she wrote. Why move a lamp? Why change the angle? Unless the person wanted to see her silhouette while standing near her door. The investigator sat back, letting the breath move slowly through his chest. He checked the witness statements. Eli, nervous, distant but consistent. Jonas, calm, withholding but logical. Tessa, observant, steady, cooperative. He reread Tessa's line. She kept her curtains closed more than usual that week. Everyone had focused on that detail, curtains closed, because it implied fear. But no one questioned why Tessa noticed so precisely. Neighbors noticed patterns, yes, but Tessa didn't say, "I think," or "maybe." She said it with certainty, as though she already understood the rhythm of Marielene's living habits, which meant she had been watching more closely than she admitted. The investigator turned to the dispatch logs. A forgotten detail returned like a faint echo. The responding deputy had recorded that Tessa was the first to call after the patrol car arrived, asking whether everything was all right. She claimed she had seen lights from her window, but the angle of her house made it impossible to see the farmhouse's interior unless she was standing outside or much closer. He checked the aerial layout, and there it was. A small footpath behind Tessa's home, leading toward the shed. Not the path from the pine cluster. A second one. One that connected only two properties. The metal button had been found behind the shed. Everyone assumed it belonged to the grain elevator coat, but the curve-shaped scratch didn't match Jonas's coat alone. It matched a pattern found on older rural work jackets, the kind Tessa wore in multiple archived photographs during winter months in the 1980s. His hand hovered over the metal button. The scratch, once a piece of ambiguous evidence, now read like a signature. The investigator turned to the hidden shed papers. The signature J. Hart had misled the investigation, drawing suspicion toward Jonas. But the second page of the hidden documents, the one he nearly missed, contained a faint watermark from a local store that burned down in 1987. The store had only printed receipts on watermarked paper for their carpentry customers. Tessa had been a carpenter's assistant for 4 years. She had the paper, she had the path, she had access to the shed, she had reason to be near the farmhouse at night. But motive. He opened the notebook again. The line. I said nothing. I think he knew I didn't believe him. Everyone assumed he was a man. But the journal never used names, never gendered the subject, never clarified the presence in the dark. The narrative relied on assumptions shaped by the earlier interview notes. What if the conflict involved something personal? Something private between two women in a small rural town during an era that left little room for misinterpretation. He reviewed the earliest interview records. Tessa had described their relationship as friendly, but she never elaborated. Her voice in the transcript was tense, clipped. She had been the only one to remark on emotional shifts, curtains closed, glances over shoulders, details that suggested proximity not just physically, but emotionally. What if the borrowed item wasn't documents? What if it was something personal? A letter, a photograph, something that belonged to Tessa, not Jonas, something she wanted back before anyone else saw it. The torn photograph suddenly took on a different dimension. The unseen person in the missing half, the one standing above Marielene, might not have been a man at all. The twist revealed itself quietly, without drama. Tessa, the neighbor. The quiet observer. The least suspected presence. The one with no listed motive. She had been the closest all along. The investigator let the conclusion settle, not triumphant, not complete, just inevitable. He stood breathing out once, long and steady. The least suspected person had been there in the silence, in the shadows, in the overlooked paths. And the case, after nearly 4 decades, shifted with a soft, devastating certainty. 7 ends with moral reflection. Truth isn't always visible on surface. The farmhouse felt different the final time the investigator entered it. Not lighter, not resolved, just quieter in a way that suggested the space had finally accepted the return of the living. The dust still hung in slow, patient spirals. The cracked mug still waited on the table. The corners still carried the cold weight of a story that never asked to be reopened. But the silence felt honest now. He walked across the warped floorboards, each creak a subdued acknowledgement of the years that had passed. The faint outline where Marielene had fallen remained unchanged, an impression left not by force, but by time's insistence on remembering what people forget. He leaned against the doorway, letting his gaze move through the room's minimal details. The crooked picture frame, the thin stack of books, the small window with its fatting curtains. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, everything ordinary until viewed from the angle of truth. The revelation of the killer had not brought satisfaction. It had brought clarity but not comfort. Tessa had walked past this house countless times, carrying her own quiet burdens, her own emotional fractures. Her motive had not been greed or sudden rage. It had been something small, human, unseen, an emotional pressure that intensified slowly until it broke. The investigator knew cases like this rarely offered clean resolutions. No perfect symbol, no decisive closure, just the steady unraveling of years-old silence. He looked toward the shed outside, barely visible through the window's frost. The hidden papers, the scratched button, the torn photograph, none of them dramatic clues, none of them cinematic, all of them subtle truths waiting for patience. Truth, he reflected, rarely arrives in bright color or sharp focus. Most of it lives in shadows, in edges of photographs, in words left unwritten, in paths that fade beneath snow. It waits for someone willing to see what others overlook. He exhaled slowly, feeling the air settle into the room. Justice had been delivered, but it felt mechanical, a process completed, a record corrected. There was no triumph in it, no victory. Just a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost. Marielene's final days had been shaped by fear that never raised its voice. Her presence lingered not in the violence of the crime, but in the stillness she left behind. The books she arranged carefully, the journal entries written with calm restraint, the fragile hope that whatever unsettled her might resolve without consequence. The investigator stepped closer to the desk where the torn photograph had once been found. He rested his hand lightly on the wood, feeling the grain beneath his palm. Some cases end loudly. Others end like this, softly, with more questions than answers, with the quiet ache of understanding how fragile the line is between safety and fear, between ordinary days and irreversible nights. He turned toward the doorway, pausing one last time. Truth isn't always visible on the surface. It rarely is. Sometimes it hides in the shadows between two neighboring homes, sometimes in a notebook's margins, sometimes in the silence of someone who watches too closely, sometimes in the grief left behind when someone slips away before anyone notices the danger. The investigator stepped outside into the cold morning air. Frost crackled softly beneath his boots. The farmhouse remained behind him, unchanged in structure but different in meaning. Justice had moved forward. But something human, something unspoken, remained unresolved. An echo the wind carried across the empty field, fading but never fully gone. He walked toward his car without looking back. Not because the case was over, but because some truths, once uncovered, ask for silence rather than celebration.